In the late autumn of 1887, on a stretch of Wyoming high ground where the wind cut instead of passed, a man stood over a dry well everyone else had already forgotten. It had no water, no use, no reason to exist. By winter, that same man, Thaddeus Turn, a widower with 2 children and no time left, would choose to live inside it. Not beside it, not near it, inside it. People noticed. At the store, at the hitching rail, outside doors that didn't quite keep the wind out, they said the same thing in different ways. A man doesn't survive winter by going underground. He buries himself. And if you've ever heard a story like this, something that sounds wrong before it proves itself right, stay a little longer. A like or subscription means a lot to us. And if you'd like, let us know where you're watching from. Because out here, the land doesn't care what makes sense. It only keeps what works. At the time, though, no one believed that. They only waited to see how long it would take for the cold to finish him. The wind shifted earlier than it should have. Not gradually. Not in the way men expected after a long summer. It turned sharp, then steady, then wrong. Each morning, the ground showed a thin crust of white. By midday, it softened just enough to mislead. By nightfall, it locked again harder, deeper, as if the land itself had made up its mind and would not be argued with. The horses along the basin edges felt it first. They turned their backs to the wind and held that position without moving, heads low, conserving heat in a way no man had yet admitted he would need to. By the time Thaddeus Turn understood what was coming, it was already close. He had come into that season alone, in a way that could not be fixed. His wife, Eliza, had died the previous spring after a fever that moved too fast and left too little time for anything but waiting. What remained was a man, a boy of 12 named Eli, and a girl of 7 called May, 3 people tied to a structure that was no longer sound. The cabin had taken damage the year before, not in one clean failure, but in a slow weakening. Wind had worked its way into the joints. The frame had shifted just enough that it no longer held tight against the air. It was the kind of problem a man might repair over weeks, given steady weather and time. He had neither. There was also the matter of Creel, a trader who extended credit in rope, nails, and iron fittings, and who kept his accounts in a way that did not forget. The debt had been manageable in summer. It was not manageable now, with winter closing in and no harvest left to bargain with. A few people in the area made the offer. It was not casual. It was not cheap. Taking in 3 more mouths through a Wyoming winter meant wood burned faster. Stores ran thinner. Sleep came harder. They offered anyway. Thaddeus listened. He nodded once to each of them. He did not argue, and he did not accept, because there was a line, not written down anywhere, that a man like him understood without needing it explained. If he crossed it once, if he set his family inside another man's walls and waited out the season on borrowed heat, he would not step back over it easily. He would become, in ways that could not be repaired by spring, someone who waited to be carried. So he chose the other option, the one that did not look like an option at all. The other option stood where no one bothered to look twice. The dry well sat out along a strip of broken ground, where stone pushed up through the soil, and the land office had seen no reason to mark it cleanly on any map. It had been dug years before, then left when the water dropped too far to matter. Thaddeus had known it for a long time, not as a solution, just as a place. He remembered lowering things into it in the hotter months. Meat wrapped in cloth, a tin of lard. Once, a bucket of water that came back up cooler than the air above it had any right to be. He remembered something else. There was no wind down there. Not the kind that ran across the open ground and stripped heat from anything it touched. The air in that shaft held still. And in the coldest weeks he could recall, when the troughs froze hard enough to take an axe to them, the stone lining of that well had never carried the same bite as the boards of a cabin wall. Those were small things, separate, not yet useful, until they were. Standing at the edge, looking down into that narrow ring of stone, the pieces came together without effort, as if they had been waiting to be set in place. The thing that held heat was not the fire. It was the ground that did not give it away. He had not discovered anything. He had only recognized what had been there the entire time. That recognition did not stay in the well. He carried it back with him. That evening, inside what remained of the cabin, Thaddeus Turn told Eli what he intended to do. He did not explain it at length. He did not dress it up to make it easier to accept. He laid it out the way a man lays down tools plain, in order, without apology. Eli listened. He did not ask if it would work. He did not say it was a bad idea. He did not say anything at all. He stood there for a moment, looking at his father, then gave a small nod and turned his attention to the things that would need to be moved. That was enough. May sat on the edge of the bedroll, watching both of them. She thought about it in the way a child does, not in terms of structure or heat, but in terms of what it would feel like. "Will it be dark?" she asked. Thaddeus looked at her. "For a while," he said, "then it won't." She accepted that. At first light, he set out across the hardening ground to find Elias Cole, a man known in that stretch of country for cutting into hillsides and digging storage cellars that held through both heat and cold. He did not go to ask for shelter. He went to ask how deep the earth stopped listening to the weather above it. Elias Cole listened without interruption. He was a hillside builder by trade, a man who had spent years cutting into earth and learning, by repetition rather than theory, what the ground would and would not allow. When Thaddeus finished, Elias did not offer encouragement. He offered a measurement. "Go down deeper than a man stands," he said. "Past that, the ground doesn't follow the weather the same way. It changes slow. Sometimes not at all." That was all. No promises, no guarantees. Just a line a man could work from. Thaddeus nodded once and left. Back at the cabin, he began to take account of what he actually had, not what would be ideal, what existed. Cottonwood planks, rough cut and uneven, wool sacks, worn thin at the seams, old blankets that had already seen more winters than they should have, an iron stove pulled from an abandoned way station, heavy and still sound, rope, lengths of scrap timber, a few straight pieces that could take weight if set right. None of it matched. None of it was designed for what he intended. But taken together, it formed something else. Not a finished structure. A beginning. Out on that ground, no man waited for the perfect set of materials. He worked with what could be carried, cut, or salvaged. Perfection was not the standard. Survival was. What he had was enough to begin. It did not make the work easier. The first thing that had to go down was the stove. They set a crossbeam over the mouth of the well, braced it with what straight timber they could find, and ran the rope over it in a crude line that would hold if handled right. The iron weight of the stove made everything else smaller by comparison. It was not just heavy, it was uneven. It shifted as it moved, pulling against the rope in a way that punished any mistake. Thaddeus took the main line. Eli took the slack. "Don't fight it," Thaddeus said. "Hold it." They eased it over the edge. For a moment, it hung steady. Then the rope slipped. Not far, not enough to lose it completely, but enough for the stove to swing and strike the stone lining with a sharp, hollow impact that echoed up through the shaft. The line jerked in Thaddeus's hands. Eli pulled back too fast, trying to correct it, and that only set the weight moving again. "Stop," Thaddeus said. Not loud, just firm. They held it there, suspended between control and loss, until the motion settled. Then they brought it back up. No anger, no wasted words. Just the understanding that the first attempt had shown them what they had not yet accounted for. They reset the rope, changed the angle, shifted where Eli stood, so the pull would stay even, instead of snapping tight. The second lowering went slower. Every foot mattered. Every inch of rope taken or given had to be deliberate. Eli watched the line in his hands, learning the feel of the weight through tension alone, when it was steady, when it wanted to turn, when it would take more than it should. By the time the stove reached the bottom and settled against the packed earth, neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say. Out there, nothing went down into the ground easily. If it did, it would not stay where you needed it. With the stove set in place, the rest of the work followed the same rule. Nothing added without purpose. Nothing placed without thought. Thaddeus did not build directly on the ground. He cut short lengths from the straighter pieces of timber and set them flat along the base, spaced just enough to carry weight without shifting. Across them, he laid the cottonwood planks, forming a rough platform that sat a few inches above the packed earth, no more than 5, measured by eye and adjusted by feel. It did not look like much. No walls, no finish, just a floor lifted slightly from where the cold lived. But that space beneath it mattered. Air that did not move did not carry heat away. The ground could hold its temperature, but it could also take from anything resting against it. By lifting the floor, even a little, he broke that direct path. Separation, not resistance. He worked without explaining it. Set one board, then another. Checked for shift. Adjusted where the wood met stone. When he was done, he stood on it once, testing the give, listening for any sound that suggested weakness. There was none. It was not warmth, not yet, but it was the first part of a system that did not rely on fighting the cold, only on refusing to let it touch more than it had to. The work did not stay unnoticed. Nothing did, in a place where distance was wide, but attention was narrow. Bram Voss, a local rancher, known for keeping his operations tight and his judgments tighter, rode past the property line one afternoon and slowed when he saw the structure taking shape where no structure should have been. He dismounted without hurry, walked the last few steps, and stood at the edge of the well, looking down into it. For a while, he said nothing. His eyes moved over the platform, the stove, the rope still tied off at the beam above. He took in the arrangement the way a man measures something before deciding whether it deserves to be taken seriously. Then he spoke. "A man building his winter in a hole," he said, his voice even, almost thoughtful. "That's not planning." He let the word settle, then finished it. "That's a man already buried." He did not raise his voice. He did not laugh. That was not his way. He simply turned, mounted up, and rode on. But the statement did not stay where he left it. It moved, from one man to another, from the store to the yard, from quiet conversation to something repeated with small variations, each one carrying the same conclusion, that Thaddeus Tern had crossed a line no one came back from, that this was not a risk. It was a mistake already made. And once a thing like that was said often enough, it stopped sounding like opinion. It began to sound like fact. The talk spread the way it always did, faster than work, slower than weather. Most came to look from a distance. One came to measure. Miriam Cole, Elias Cole's daughter, had spent enough years working alongside her father to understand that most structures failed for reasons that had nothing to do with intention. She arrived on foot, without comment, and walked straight to the well. She did not stand back. She looked down, then turned her attention to the details others had ignored. "Where does the smoke go?" she asked. Thaddeus pointed to the pipe he had fitted through a narrow gap between stone and timber, angled just enough to encourage draw without letting the wind force its way back in. She nodded once. "And moisture?" she asked. He reached down, lifted a corner of one of the wool sacks lining the lower edge of the platform, showing how it sat between the air and the stone. Not sealed, not tight, just enough to break the direct contact and slow the damp. "Airflow?" she continued. Thaddeus indicated the small intake he had cut higher up, offset from the main opening, placed where the prevailing wind would pass across it rather than into it. No theory, no explanation beyond the placement itself. Miriam watched for a moment longer. She did not offer approval. She did not dismiss it. Instead, she shifted her weight, studying how the parts worked together, not in isolation, but as a system. "It might hold," she said finally. That was all. She turned and left the way she had come. No one laughed after that, but no one changed their mind either. Not yet. Not yet, but the night would make its own judgment. They did not wait for winter to prove itself. By the time the light began to thin that evening, Thaddeus had already decided what he had built would either hold under real use or fail before the cold made the decision for him. He did not say it out loud. He just began moving what mattered. Eli carried down the blankets first, lowering them carefully so they would not drag against the stone. May followed with what small things she could hold: tin cup, a folded cloth, a bundle tied too tight for its size. Thaddeus went last, checking each step, each knot, each placement, until the three of them stood at the bottom of the well, with the last of the daylight narrowing above them. It was quieter there, not silent, but different, the kind of quiet that did not shift with the wind. He set a small fire in the stove, not large, not built to impress, just enough to bring the iron to life and take the edge off what would otherwise settle in around them. The flame caught, then steadied, the heat rising slowly into a space that did not give it away as quickly as a cabin would. They waited. Time moved differently in that space. Without the wind against the walls, without the constant sound of air moving past wood and seam, the hours felt less like something passing and more like something holding. It was not warm, not in the way a man might describe comfort, but it did not cut. The cold did not press in through gaps. It did not reach down from above in sharp drops. It stayed where it was, held at the edges, slowed by the stone and the stillness. Eli lay down first, pulling the blanket up without speaking. He shifted once, then settled. May followed, closer to the stove, watching the small movement of the flame until her eyes closed without effort. Thaddeus remained seated for a while longer, measuring the space in the only way that mattered. How much wood it took, how long the heat stayed, what changed and what did not. By the time he lay down, the fire had already burned lower. He did not add more. Above them, the temperature dropped the way it always did, fast, without warning, stripping heat from every surface that could not hold it. Down below, the change was slower, narrower, contained. When morning came, it brought no shock, no sudden loss, just the same quiet air, the same measured cold, and the same small fire that had done its work without being asked to fight more than it could. The wood they had used would not have lasted a single night in the cabin. Down here, it had been enough. The difference was not in the fire. It was in where the fire no longer had to work. And in that difference, something had already shifted. The winter had not begun in full, but the terms of it had. And for the first time, the cold was no longer the thing setting them. And that shift did not disappear with the next night. It held. After a few days of living below ground, the pattern began to show itself in a way that did not require explanation. It showed in the hours that had always been the hardest. Eli noticed it first. He had grown used to waking before light in the cabin, not because he chose to, but because the cold made the decision for him. There, the fire would burn down in the dark hours, and whatever heat had been built through the evening would be gone by morning. The cold would come in fast, settle into the boards, the air, the blankets, everything. Morning meant starting over. But down in the well, he woke one day and stayed still for a moment longer than usual, not from reluctance, from confusion. It was not warm. It was never warm in that sense, but it was not worse than it had been the night before. The cold had not deepened. It had not moved closer. It had simply remained where it was. He sat up, looking toward the stove, then toward the stone walls that held the space in place. "It's the same," he said. Thaddeus looked at him. Eli did not try to explain it further. He did not need to. On the surface, dawn was always the lowest point, the moment when the fire was weakest, and the cold had done its work unchecked. But here, that drop did not come. The night passed without taking anything with it. The temperature did not fall away. It stayed. Thaddeus said nothing. He did not mark it out loud. He did not turn it into proof with words. But he noted it all the same, not as a single good night, as something that repeated, and out on that land, repetition was the only kind of proof that mattered. And once a thing repeated, it stopped being chance. Out on that kind of ground, no one spoke in terms of theory. They spoke in terms of what held and what did not. The earth, once a man went down far enough, did not follow the same rules as the air above it. It did not swing wide with the seasons. It did not rise and fall with every change in wind. It moved slowly, if it moved at all. A cabin stood in the open. Every wall it had was an argument with the weather. Every seam was a place where heat could leave and cold could enter. But down in the well, the walls did not argue. They limited the exchange. The stone did not make the space warm. It simply stopped the constant taking that happened above ground. It turned a losing fight into a contained one. It was not so different from stepping out of a hard wind and into a barn. The air inside the barn was not hot, but it was steady. The wind no longer stripped heat from the body with every passing second. What a man carried with him, he kept longer. That was the difference. Up above, a fire had to fight the cold on every side, all the time. It burned not just to warm the space, but to replace what was being taken away. Down below, the fire was no longer in a fight it could not win. It was dealing only with what remained, and that changed the scale of everything. It meant less wood, less strain, less loss. It was not a new idea, not in the way men like to think of new things. It was an old truth, sitting in plain sight, waiting for someone to stop looking at the wind long enough to notice the ground beneath it. That truth held, but it did not hold perfectly. No system did. After several nights below ground, new problems began to show themselves. Not in ways that could be ignored, in ways that demanded correction. The first came from something no man could remove: breath. 3 people in a confined space meant moisture building slowly, then steadily. At first, it was nothing more than a faint dampness along the stone. Then it became visible, small beads forming where the air met the colder surface, collecting, hanging, and finally falling in uneven drops. It did not flood the space, but it did not belong there either. The second problem came when Thaddeus pushed the fire harder than before. He added more wood than the system required, testing what would happen if he tried to force warmth instead of letting it settle. The stove answered quickly. The heat rose, but so did the smoke. Not all of it found the path out. Some of it lingered. That night, the air thickened in a way that could not be ignored. Eli woke first, not from cold, but from the weight of it, the difference in the air, the way it moved less cleanly through the lungs. He sat up, looking toward the pipe, then toward the opening above. "It's not clearing," he said. Thaddeus was already moving. He crossed the small space, reached the upper opening, and forced it wider, breaking the stillness just enough to let the trapped air escape. The shift was immediate, but not complete. It took time for the space to correct itself. They did not sleep the same way for the rest of that night. By morning, the problems were clear. Not failures that ended the attempt, but weaknesses that could not remain. Thaddeus adjusted the system the same way he had built it, without theory, without excess. He shifted the intake opening so the wind passed across it instead of pressing into it, creating a draw rather than resistance. He widened the exit path for smoke, not enough to lose heat, but enough to ensure that nothing remained trapped. And each evening, before the fire was set, he opened the space above for a short time, allowing the built-up moisture to leave before it could settle again. None of these changes were large. None of them would have meant much on their own. But together, they corrected the balance. The space held again. Not because it was perfect, but because it had been adjusted to match what it actually was. They were no longer testing an idea. They were learning the limits of it and shaping it until it worked. They did not have to wait long for the next test. It came early, not as a full winter, but as a warning of what was already on its way. The wind shifted again, harder this time. It did not ease through the basin it drove across it, low and fast, cutting along the ground as if searching for every opening it could find. By midday, the troughs began to lock. Water that had been moving in the morning turned solid before evening. By nightfall, the surface held like iron. Men saw it and responded the only way they knew how. They fed their fires. All day, wood that had been meant to last weeks began to shorten in stacks. Smoke rose constant from cabins that had never needed it that way before. Doors stayed shut. Movement slowed. Above ground, the system was already straining. Below, Thaddeus made one adjustment. He added a little more wood to the stove. Not much. Enough to raise the heat slightly, not enough to force it. Then he waited. The wind passed overhead, but it did not reach them the same way. It pressed across the opening, tested the edges, searched for a path inside, but the structure did not give it one. The air below stayed still, the temperature shifting only within a narrow range, holding where it had been instead of falling away. The cold came, but it did not take anything with it. Through that short spell, the difference became clear, not in comfort, but in demand. Above, the fire had to keep replacing what the wind stripped away. Below, the fire only needed to maintain what was already held. When the cold eased a day later, the basin returned to motion. Men stepped outside again. Smoke thinned. Work resumed in small ways, as if the land had only paused. But the measure had been taken. This was not the full winter. Not yet, but it had been enough. Enough to show that the system did not collapse under pressure. Enough to prove that it held its shape when the weather pressed against it. And out there, that kind of proof carried forward. If it could hold through this, then it might hold through what was coming next. That next test did not wait for the calendar. It came before the old men said it should. The first sign was not the cold. It was the wind. It did not rise and fall. It did not shift and settle. It held constant, driving across the basin with a force that flattened what stood against it and stripped what could not hold. Snow did not fall in flakes. It moved sideways. A white sheet carried at eye level, blinding, cutting, erasing distance. Then the temperature dropped. Not gradually. It fell as if something had been removed from the air all at once. What warmth remained on the ground disappeared in hours. Water froze solid. Wood stiffened. Breath turned sharp and visible in the span of a single exhale. There was no time to prepare. Whatever a man had in place when it began was what he had to survive it. Livestock went first. Animals that had stood through other winters began to fail within a day. Those left exposed did not last the night. Those brought in fared better, but not all of them held. The cold reached into every gap, every weakness, every place where a structure had been built to resist instead of contain. Men answered the only way they could. They fed their fires harder, more wood, more often, no pause between. Stacks that had been measured for the season began to shorten at a pace no one had planned for. Smoke poured from chimneys without break, but it did not mean safety. It meant consumption. Above ground, every hour became a calculation. How much wood remained, how long it would last, what would happen when it ran out. The storm did not ease. It did not give space to recover, or time to adjust. It pressed, and kept pressing. Out on that land, there was no argument left to make. Nature did not negotiate. It judged. And once it began, there was no room left for error. And under that judgment, the difference showed itself in the only place that could not be argued. Not in numbers, in bodies. While the storm drove across the basin without pause, Thaddeus kept the same rhythm he had set before it arrived. He fed the stove twice a day. Once in the early hours, once again before night settled in fully. Each time, the amount of wood he used could be carried in one arm. No more. He did not increase it to match the storm. He did not try to overpower what was happening above ground. He held to what the system required, and no more than that. Down below, the space responded the same way it always had. It held. Eli lay down at night and did not wake to the cold. There was no point in the dark hours where the air shifted enough to pull him out of sleep. No moment where the body tightened against a drop that came too fast. He slept through. May slept as well. And when she woke, it was not from discomfort. It was from hunger. She sat up one morning, rubbing her eyes, asking for something to eat before she asked about anything else. Her voice carried no strain, no hesitation, no sign that the night had taken anything from her. That was the measure. Out on that land, a child did not sleep through cold, and a child did not wake hungry if the body had spent the night trying to stay alive. There was no argument against it, no way to explain it away. This was not a claim. It was evidence, the kind that did not need to be spoken, only observed. Evidence, once it existed, did not stay hidden. It moved, and eventually, it reached the man who had named the outcome before it began. Bram Voss came back, not with a group, not with commentary. He rode up alone and dismounted the same way he had before, steady, controlled, as if nothing about the situation required urgency. He stood at the edge of the well and looked down. He did not call out. He did not repeat what he had said weeks earlier. He watched. After a moment, he walked back to his horse, reached into a sack, and brought out a small bag of flour. He lowered it carefully, letting Eli take the line from below. Thaddeus said nothing. In return, he brought up a cut of meat that had been kept beneath the platform, firm, preserved, not frozen solid, not spoiled. Bram took it in his hands, turned it once, then set it aside. He looked down again, and this time, he chose to see it from where it was happening. He climbed, careful on the way down, steady as the space narrowed around him. When his boots touched the platform, he straightened and stood there, taking in the air, the walls, the small stove, the stillness that did not shift with the storm above. No wind, no sharp drop, no strain in the breath. He did not speak. Time passed long enough to notice, long enough to understand what he was feeling and what he was not. Then, he looked at Thaddeus. No anger, no defense, no need to recover what had been said before. Just the weight of a conclusion that had changed. I was wrong. Nothing more followed. It did not need to. After that, the storm still had days left in it, but something had already shifted. When it finally eased, when the wind broke, and the snow settled into something that could be crossed instead of fought, people began to move again. Doors opened, smoke thinned, tracks appeared where there had been none. And then they came, not in groups, not with noise, one at a time. They walked to the edge of the well and looked down, just as Bram had. But they did not repeat what had been said before. They did not measure the idea against what they already believed. They asked, not why, how. How did you set the floor? Where does the air come in? What keeps the smoke moving? Thaddeus answered each question the same way he had answered Miriam, by pointing. He showed where the intake sat off to the side, not in the wind's path. He showed how the platform rested above the ground, breaking contact instead of trying to resist it. He showed where the heat moved and where it did not. Don't let the wind run through it, he said once. That was as close as he came to instruction. Miriam returned as well, this time with others behind her. She did not speak over him. She watched, and when needed, clarified what was already there in front of them. Bram came again, not alone now, but with his son Noah walking beside him. The boy looked down into the well with the same attention his father had shown, but without the weight of having been wrong first. Within days, the first cuts appeared in the hillsides nearby, shallow at first, then deeper. Men who had spent years building against the wind began, quietly, to build out of it. They did not repeat Thaddeus's words. Most of them did not remember them, but they followed the structure. And out on that land, that was what lasted. The winter did not end all at once. It loosened its hold in small ways first. The wind lost its edge. The snow settled instead of moving. Water began to show again, in places where it had been locked for months. By spring, the land opened just enough to choose again. Thaddeus did not return to the old cabin. He walked the ground the way he had before, not looking for what seemed best, but for what would hold. He chose a stretch of land that most would have passed over thin soil, poor for crops, but backed by a low hillside that broke the wind before it could gather speed. It was not fertile, but it was stable. That was enough. He built into it, not on top of it. Cut back into the slope. Set the main space where the ground could do the same work the well had done, holding steady, limiting loss, keeping the air from running where it should not. The structure did not look like much from a distance. Lower, quieter, less exposed, but it required less wood, less repair, less constant attention. It held, Years passed without the same strain that had marked the seasons before. The work did not stop, but it changed in kind. Less fighting, more maintaining. Eli grew into the same habits. When the time came for him to build on his own, he did not return to the patterns that had failed. He cut into the land, set his walls where the wind could not take from them, and worked from the same understanding that had carried them through. It was no longer an experiment. It was a way of building, not just to survive a winter, but to live through many of them, without being worn down each time. In time, the well itself disappeared, not all at once, not in a single season. It filled gradually, as things do when they are no longer needed. Snow collapsed its edges. Dirt slid inward. What had once been a shaft of stone became a shallow depression, then less than that, until there was nothing left to mark where it had been. But the work that had been done there did not disappear with it. Men remembered what they had seen, even when they no longer remembered where they had seen it first. They cut into hillsides. They set floors above the ground instead of against it. They placed openings where air would move as it should, not as it pleased. They did not speak of it as a method. They spoke of it as the way things were done. And then, over time, they stopped speaking of it at all. The names fell away first. That is how it happens. The land does not keep records, and the work itself does not carry signatures. What remains is what proves itself, again and again, until it no longer needs to be explained. The winters did not change. The wind did not soften. The cold did not become less severe. Nature held to its terms, the same as it always had, but the people who lived on that land changed how they met it. They stopped trying to stand against what could not be resisted. They began, instead, to work with what would not move. And in that shift, something quiet took hold. Not a story, not a name, a way of building that did not ask to be remembered, only to be used. He left nothing behind that could be pointed to and claimed, but he left something else, a way to endure that did not depend on being known. If you had seen it with your own eyes, would you have mocked him too, or stepped down into that well before the winter made the choice for you?